When we use the word radioactive, we usually think of something that looks normal on the outside, but carries this invisible energy that slowly damages everything around it. If you get too close, you feel sick, your health starts to decay, and even if you walk away, the effects linger. Now think about that same concept applied to personality. There are some people who, without fully realizing it, carry an energy that pushes others away. That drains the life from interactions, that poisons relationships. And just like radiation, it's not always obvious in the beginning. You meet someone, they seem fine, but over time you start to feel worse around them, less safe, less alive. And sometimes we're the ones carrying that energy without knowing it. What makes a personality radioactive? It's not about being a bad person. It's about patterns of behavior, thought, and emotion that leak into our interactions and slowly corrode trust, warmth, and connection. And the hardest part is that most of these patterns are defense mechanisms. They were built for survival. Maybe as a child you learned that you couldn't rely on people, so you developed cynicism. Maybe you grew up around conflict, so you learned to lash out before anyone else could hurt you. Maybe you were abandoned, so you cling desperately when someone gets close. These strategies made sense at the time. They protected you. But now, as an adult, those same defenses are toxic to the people around you. They radiate insecurity, hostility, or neediness, and instead of drawing people in, they push people away. One of the clearest signs of a radioactive personality is that people consistently feel drained after spending time with you. Think about the people in your life who you avoid answering texts from, not because they're bad people, but because every interaction feels heavy. Maybe they always complain, maybe they always argue, maybe they always demand validation. That heaviness is a sign of radiation. And if you find that people are avoiding you, ghosting you, pulling away after initial closeness, that might be a sign you're carrying some of that energy. Another sign is that conflict follows you everywhere. If every group you join ends in drama, if every relationship you enter eventually collapses in the same way, if every workplace feels hostile, the common denominator may be you. That doesn't mean you're evil or unworthy. It means there's something about your patterns that ignites conflict. Maybe you interpret neutral comments as criticism, maybe you gossip, maybe you dominate conversations. And here's the tough part. Radioactive personalities often don't realize what they're redoing. They feel like victims of endless bad luck, not recognizing that they're carrying the very spark that lights the fire. Jealousy is another radioactive trait. When you can't be happy for other people's success, when you always have to one-up stories, when you secretly resent anyone doing better than you, people sense it. Even if you smile and say congratulations, the undertone of bitterness leaks through. Humans are very sensitive to emotional authenticity. They can feel when your words don't match your inner state. And being around jealousy feels like standing in a cloud of toxic fumes. Over time, people distance themselves because no one wants to constantly feel guilty for being happy. Control is another form of radiation. If you can't let people be themselves, if you criticize every choice, if you manipulate situations so they bend to your will, you're poisoning the relationship. Sometimes control looks like aggression, but sometimes it looks like martyrdom. You say things like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." That guilt trip is radioactive because it transforms love into obligation. And obligation kills intimacy. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Radioactive personalities are not only harmful to others, they're harmful to themselves. Just like radiation eats away at the body from within, these toxic patterns eat away at your own happiness. If you push people away, you end up lonely. If you cling too tightly, you end up abandoned. If you demand too much validation, you never feel secure. If you lash out in anger, you carry shame afterward. The personality becomes a prison, and you're the one locked inside. But why do we become radioactive in the first place? It almost always comes from pain. At some point, you were not accepted for who you were. At some point, you were hurt, ignored, betrayed. And your mind said, okay, I need to develop a way to protect myself. So you learned to keep people at arm's length with sarcasm. You learned to control people so you wouldn't be abandoned. You learn to criticize so you wouldn't be criticized first. You learn to cling so you wouldn't be left alone. These are survival strategies. But here is the paradox. The strategies that once protected you are now the very things that keep you unsafe. They prevent real intimacy. They prevent healing. They prevent growth. So how do we fix it? The first step is recognition. You cannot heal what you refuse to see. And this is the hardest part because the ego resists it. It's painful to admit that maybe you're the problem, that maybe your energy is toxic. But unless you're willing to look in the mirror, you'll spend your life blaming others, thinking the world is unfair, wondering why people keep leaving. Recognition requires humility. It requires asking, what is the common denominator in all my failed friendships, my failed relationships, my conflicts? And if the answer keeps coming back to you, then that's where the work begins. The second step is understanding. Instead of beating yourself up for being toxic, you have to understand where these patterns came from. This is where psychology and neuroscience help. The brain is shaped by experience. If you grew up in chaos, your nervous system learned to be on guard. That hypervigilance now shows up as paranoia or defensiveness. If you grew up without affection, your brain developed a hunger for validation, and now you cling. If you grew up with criticism, your inner critic became so loud that you silence others with judgment before they can silence you. When you see the origin, you realize you're not broken, you're conditioned. And what is conditioned can be reconditioned. The third step is practice. You can't just decide one day to stop being radioactive. You need to practice new patterns. That means catching yourself when you're about to criticize and choosing curiosity instead. That means noticing when jealousy arises and consciously celebrating someone else's success. That means sitting with the discomfort of vulnerability instead of reaching for control. And practice means failure. You will slip. You will still radiate sometimes. But each time you notice, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen the new one. Neuroplasticity is real. Your brain can rewire, but it needs repetition. The fourth step is connection. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. If your personality became radioactive through damaged relationships, it will heal through healthy ones. That means surrounding yourself with people who can set boundaries, who can model healthy communication, who can give feedback without shaming you. Sometimes that's friends, sometimes it's a therapist, sometimes it's a support group. But you need mirrors that reflect a healthier way of being. Because when you're radioactive, your self-perception is distorted. You need others to show you what safe looks like. The fifth step is compassion. A lot of people who discover they're toxic swing to the other extreme of self-hatred. They say, I'm horrible, I ruin everything, I don't deserve love. That is just another form of radiation turned inward. What you need is compassion. You did not choose to become this way. You adapted, and now you're choosing to grow. That's noble. That's brave. And compassion gives you the patience to keep going even when the process feels slow. Over time, as you recognize, understand, practice, connect, and show compassion, the radioactive energy starts to fade. People stop avoiding you. Relationships become lighter. You notice less conflict, more trust, more peace. And inside, you feel less frantic, less ashamed, more grounded. You realize that you don't have to manipulate to be loved. You don't have to lash out to be safe. You don't have to cling to be cared for. Love, safety, and care flow naturally when you stop radiating toxicity. And here's the beautiful part. Once you detox, the very wounds that made you radioactive become the source of your wisdom. Because you know what it's like to push people away, you can recognize it in others and offer empathy. Because you know what it's like to be jealous, you can guide others towards self-acceptance. Because you know what it's like to control, you can appreciate the freedom of letting go. Your scars become lessons, and your lessons become light. You go from being radioactive to being radiant. So if you're listening to this and realizing, maybe I'm the one with the radioactive personality, don't despair. This is not a death sentence. This is an invitation. An invitation to grow, to evolve, to reclaim your humanity. Everyone has toxic patterns. The question is whether you're willing to face them. And if you are, then step by step, with awareness and practice, you can transform. You can go from a personality that corrodes relationships to one that nourishes them. From a person people avoid to a person people seek out. From someone trapped in pain to someone free to love and be loved. And that's the real cure. It's not about fixing a personality defect. It's about healing the wounds that created it. When the wounds heal, the toxicity fades. And what remains is your authentic self, the part of you that has always been there, waiting to shine once the radiation clears. This is about 2,000 words. Do you want me to continue expanding it fully to 4,000 with deeper dives into case examples of radioactive behaviors in friendships, workplaces, and relationships? More neuroscience of why these patterns form. Step-by-step lived practices for detoxing personality traits. Stories that make it relatable in Dr. K's style.